we've talked quite a lot about the difficulties with national government policy and all this sort of thing. And there is also, and it does sound depressing, we've been driven in the last couple of years under Owen Paterson by complete indifference from DEFRA in terms of air quality policy. And all the stuff in the last week has sort of shown why, because he has simply not been interested in the environment. And that can explain why DEFRA has been just completely useless and really done very little, and government hasn't taken it seriously. We've had the backstop of Europe, which has given us these guidelines and limits, which we've been able to say, OK, DEFRA, you're really not doing your job, but we're going to start using the law to make you do it. But there's been a reshuffle in the last couple of weeks in Europe, and there was a particularly good Environment Commissioner, Janusz Potocznik. I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, but he really championed the environment. And some would say that he sold out recently because they were redoing the limits. And the World Health Organization said, well, the limits aren't tight enough, we need them tighter. And the Commission looked at this, and everybody knew they should be tighter. But Potocznik said, well, actually, we decided not to tighten them, because if we went to the Commission and said we want to tighten the limits, it would open up the discussion where all the sceptics would turn around and say, do we need these limits at all? And actually, we could end up losing a whole lot. And he saw that off. He could see it coming. He saw it off, and we retained the limits. And he said, well, look, we're not meeting the limits. Let's keep what we've got, and let's see how we can get on with it. And that seemed to be a good thing. Some people said it was a sellout. It seemed to be a good sort of realpolitik thing to me. However, in the latest reshuffle in the last week, this is the Juncker Commission, they've actually amalgamated his post. So he's off. And the environment post has been just amalgamated into a whole load of others. And they now report to the industry directorate, which now means that anything coming out of Brussels has to go through the businessmen, if you like, who are starting to say, well, competitiveness and all that. And this is really worrying because, we've got nobody championing air quality and environment in Europe, and that is one to watch. But for now, we do have the directives, we have the limits, and we have, luckily, we've got Client Earth and Alan Andrews, who's using those limits to badger the government. So let's hear how that's going.
Okay, hi everyone. I should probably start by just explaining a little bit about who Client Earth are and what we do, because people tend to have a certain conception of what lawyers are and what they do based on usually pretty negative experiences of divorce and buying houses and that sort of thing. So if I achieve nothing else today, maybe I'll slightly shift that perception. Essentially what we do is take the law and use that as a tool to protect human health and the environment, as simple as that. I kind of see my job as taking the science that Ian and his colleagues produce and trying to turn that into something that we can actually force governments to pay attention to. And I know Ian said we should get away from focusing on limits. Unfortunately, it's the only thing we have to work with, so I do unapologetically focus on limits. I accept that the limits aren't good enough. We could have complete compliance with all the EU limit values in the country, and we would still have a major public health problem. But we would be in a much better place than we are today. So I'll just talk a bit about the story to date. This case that we brought has been going on for about 4 years with various ups and downs along the way. And I'm just going to try and talk you through those and hopefully show you how that gives us a bit of hope for the future. Sorry for being London-centric again, but this is where we started, really. We started looking at air quality in London. It's where our office is based. It's actually based in Hackney, so one of those heavily polluted areas that Ian showed you earlier. This is Oxford Street, or what the Sunday Times recently labelled Knoxford Street, on account of Ian winces, on account of one of Ian's colleagues being quoted as at a conference speculating whether Oxford Street might have some of the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide in the world. This caused a huge kerfuffle, and the mayor actually came out and said that this was bollocks, to quote him. And for once, I actually agree with the mayor, because it's not even the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide in London. This is Brixton Road in Lambeth. I used to actually live about 5 minutes away from where this photo was taken. And there you have levels of nitrogen dioxide approaching 150 micrograms per metre cubed this year as an annual average. That is approaching 4 times the legal limit set in EU law. Now, EU law sets these limit values, which are loosely based on WHO guidelines, based on scientific assessments of what we know about the impacts on human health. There's a very absolute duty to achieve compliance with the limits by a certain date. For nitrogen dioxide, that date was 2010. So we're already 4 years past the deadline. And the directive also imposes this secondary obligation. Where you fail to meet the limit, you then have to do something about it. You have to come up with a plan showing how you're going to address the problem in the shortest time possible. Now remember that phrase, because it's absolutely critical to this whole issue, and particularly the case that Client Earth's brought. Now, the more we delved into this issue, the more we came to realise that this wasn't just a London problem. All right, it's particularly severe in London, but breaches of nitrogen dioxide limits are happening in towns and cities throughout the UK. For reasons I'll come on to, we focused on the 16 zones and agglomerations, to use the horrible EU jargon. Basically, 16 regions or cities and urban areas where the plans that DEFRA produced showed compliance wouldn't be achieved until after 2015. Now, that date's significant because that was the very maximum deadline if you submitted a time extension notification to the European Commission. So basically, the directive lets you get an extra 5 years if you can show the Commission that you've got the problem under control and you've got a plan in place to achieve compliance by that extended deadline. When we actually started looking at the plans that DEFRA produced in 2011, what we saw was not just that they weren't achieving compliance by 2015, but also there was an absolutely embarrassing lack of ambition in those plans. Basically, all DEFRA had done was go around and gather up all the local air quality action plans, put them all together in a nice-looking document, come up with a load of excuses, mainly to do with the failure of the Euro standards for diesel vehicles, and then send that off to the Commission. In terms of actual new measures, in fact, in terms of actual new national policies to address air quality, we could only identify one, and that was this: to investigate the feasibility of a national framework for low emission zones. They haven't even made any progress on that one single measure in the 4 years that this matter's been in the courts. So faced with what we saw was real, to quote an earlier speaker, indifference on the part of government, we felt we had no real option but to go to the courts. Not something we enter into lightly. It's a pretty huge undertaking. Not least, it exposes you to huge financial risk. If you lose a case, you're made to pay not just your own fees, but the legal fees of the winning party. So you can be on the hook for tens of thousands of pounds as well. These are the 16 zones and agglomerations that were included in our original case. You'll see that Sheffield isn't among them. That's because Sheffield was one of the cities for which a time extension was sought, which would extend the deadline till 2015. So we left those out of our case. This is the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom in Westminster, just opposite the Houses of Parliament. This is where we ended up in May 2013. We'd had 2-3 years of setbacks. We'd pretty much lost in the High Court. We'd succeeded in showing that the limits were breached and that the government was failing to comply with its obligations. But we'd failed to convince the court that they had to do anything about that. They wouldn't give us a legal remedy. Their view was that if the European Commission had a problem with the government's plans, It was really their job to come forward and take action against the UK, and it wasn't a matter for the domestic courts. We appealed to the Court of Appeal and got largely the same result. So all very demoralising, very depressing. But in the Supreme Court, we had a bit of a breakthrough. I think for the first time, we really felt the judges were actually engaging with the arguments we were raising. They really had a look at what DEFRA's plans contained and clearly weren't too impressed. And they did two things. First, they gave a formal declaration that the UK was in breach of its obligations. Now, you might say, well, so what? Didn't everyone know that that was the case anyway? Well, yes. But the crucial thing was the reasons they gave for giving us this declaration. And that was this, tucked away in paragraph 16 of the judgment. They said they were making this declaration to make clear that the way was open to immediate enforcement at national or European level. And I'll explain what they meant by that in a minute. But probably the more important thing was that they referred the case on to the European Court of Justice under what's known as the preliminary reference procedure. Now, basically, the preliminary reference procedure allows national courts to refer questions of interpretation of EU law to the court, the European Court, based in Luxembourg. Now, a lot of EU legislation is frankly gobbledygook. You can read it and have absolutely no idea what it means. And I'm afraid the Air Quality Directive is no exception. It's quite ambiguous, quite vaguely drafted, for very good reasons. I mean, these things are negotiated in Brussels, and you have to get everyone to agree to it, 28 member states. So what happens is you fudge things a little bit, you make things a little bit vague, just so that you can get it through Parliament. But then we have to work out what it all means. So these two questions have been referred to the European Court. They will rule on these questions. They will determine what the law means and what obligations it impose. The case then comes back to the National Court for a final ruling. There were 4 questions in total, but these are the 2 important ones. Firstly, what does the directive mean when it says that you've got to come up with a plan to achieve compliance in the shortest time possible? And secondly, what is the role of national courts in enforcing obligations under the directive where the government has breached it? Now, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, and I'm probably going to fail miserably in Ian's task of explaining things as if you were 7 years old. That declaration that the Supreme Court made, saying that it was to make clear that the way was available for enforcement at the EU level, what that did was brought the Commission into play. About 8 months after the Supreme Court declaration, this guy, Janusz Potocznik, launched infringement action against the UK. So the Supreme Court had basically given them a big invitation. The UK says, it's your job to enforce, well, come on, come and do it. And they duly did. So the UK was the first and remains the only member state in Europe to have had action taken against it on nitrogen dioxide. But it won't be the last. There are others in the pipeline, and we'll see them come forward in the coming 12 months. It's also worth saying there are 17 other member states in breach of PM10 limits, and they're also subject to infringement action. What really annoyed people within DEFRA and elsewhere was the fact that the Commission chose to issue a press release specifically naming and shaming the UK, which is a bit unusual. It doesn't normally do that at this stage of infringement. So they clearly wanted to show the UK a bit of a lesson. They must have done something to annoy them in the process. That led to a hell of a lot of press coverage, most of which focused on the question of fines and this idea that the UK was going to be fined hundreds of millions of pounds or euros, depending on which paper you read. I think it's important just to keep the fines issue in perspective. It's definitely a very real threat. The fine would definitely be very large, but it is a long way off. It would take years for the Commission to actually get to the stage where it was able to recommend a fine to the European Court. So basically what we have now is 2 separate legal actions happening in parallel against the UK in relation to nitrogen dioxide. This table here just tries to explains some of the similarities and differences between the two cases. In many ways, they're identical. That's quite deliberate. The Commission has basically copied our case and sort of heaped the pressure on the UK by adding their voice to ours. But there are some subtle but very important differences, mainly in terms of the remedy available. Our case eventually comes back to the UK courts to determine what actually happens next. And what we're really looking for is an order forcing the government to come up with a new plan, a plan that actually contains some new measures, a plan that will actually achieve compliance in a much shorter time frame. By contrast, the Commission will eventually bring its case to the European Court. They can only make a declaration at the first stage that the UK is in breach. The Commission would then have to bring a second round of litigation before a fine was available. So it's a very slow process, and also it's important to realise a really political process. It's a political negotiation between the Commission and the member state as much as anything else. But I think the biggest difference is timing. Our case is much further advanced and is moving much more quickly than the Commission's ever will. This case should be resolved by the middle of next year. As I said, the Commission's will take many more years to get anywhere. So as a result, our case ended up here in July this year. This is this weird-looking building in Luxembourg where the European Court's based. Absolutely massive. It's about 20 stories high. It really is quite incredible. We had a day in court, which we felt went pretty well. Crucially, the Commission intervened in our case. Their lawyers came along and said their piece as well, and they were almost exactly on the same track as we were. So basically, again, you've got this Commission and Client Earth versus the UK on this issue. That's just a brief chronology showing the order in which these events have happened. I'll skip through that. Our case is the first time that anyone's tested the 2008 Air Quality Directive in the European Court. So we're slightly in uncharted territory. That's why the Commission is so interested and so supportive of our case. It has all these other cases it wants to bring against other member states, but it wants to see how the court interprets the directive, and in particular this question, as short as possible. What does that mean? You have member states all over Europe who are projecting breaches of limit values for decades ahead, 2020, even 2030 in some cases. So they want to see how we do, and are sitting back with interest watching. Now, it would make me nervous, but there are reasons. Sorry, that is a guinea lion, for those of you who aren't familiar. Absolutely love the internet, the fact that I could go on there and find that. It's even in a wintry surrounding, wintry scene, because that's when we'll get the judgment, you see, in December, hopefully this year. Anyway, we're a brave guinea pig because we've got a lot of European case law behind us which supports our case. And I'll just give a very quick run-through of some of those cases. Probably the most important one was the Janacek case. This is Mr. Janacek. He was a guy who lived in a very polluted part of Munich in Germany. He brought a case before the regional courts in Germany, which eventually, like our case, got referred to the European Court. And this is where we get this idea that we have a right to clean air in EU law. Where EU limit values are breached, we have a right to go before our national courts and demand that action is taken. And that right was upheld by the European Court and then by the German court. But it was under the old directive. So this is the first time anyone's tried this with the new directive, which has this wording around plans having to achieve compliance in as short a time as possible. Now, there's another more recent case where the European Court considered air quality. And this was when the Commission brought a case against Italy. For some reason, well, not most, but an awful lot of environmental cases at the EU level concern Italy. Don't know why that is. But Italy basically said it couldn't comply with PM10 limits for a range of reasons. They blamed the weather. They blamed the failure of European vehicle emission standards. and a whole host of other excuses. And the European Court gave them very short shrift. They said it is irrelevant whether the failure to fulfill obligations is a result of intention or negligence by the member state or of technical difficulties encountered by it. So they take this really almost draconian attitude to limit values. And that's not just for air quality, that's for any limit that is set to protect human health. So water quality, waste, all these sorts of limits. And that shouldn't really have come as a surprise to anyone, least of all the Italians, because there's a long line of case law where the European Court has taken these sorts of attitudes. And these are just some of the things that the European Court has said are not relevant when it comes to achieving compliance with limits. Financial matters, political worries, legal, technical difficulties, weather, crime, riots. So we talked about the unpopularity of some of the measures that you might have to introduce. There was a case in Italy where the local population actually rioted because they didn't want a waste incinerator in their town. The European Court said that wasn't a relevant consideration. The reason we've got Don Corleone here is because there was another Italian case where the Italians said they couldn't meet their waste targets because the mob was running all their waste installations. Again, court wasn't interested. So if you start to apply this sort of logic to the questions in our case, you start to see which direction the European Court might go. And you might also look at what's happening in national courts in member states. The lawyer who I know very well, who brought the Janacek case, is now bringing a whole load of cases in Germany on the same basis. And there, the German courts are quite prepared to look at the plans and say, no, these aren't good enough. This isn't achieving compliance in the shortest time possible. Go away, come back with a better plan. And that's happened in Hesse and Bavaria, and there's a whole load of other cases pending. So while this doesn't actually bind the European Court or bind the UK courts, it is persuasive. It shows the way that judges in Europe are starting to think about these questions. Now, I should probably explain what DEFRA's case is, what the UK's arguments are, but I'm going to struggle because I still don't really know what they are. They seem to have played a bit of a flat bat to this whole question about what does as short as time as possible mean. There was, in their written observations to the court, they devoted about 30 pages to the other questions. They devoted 1 page to that question, despite it being by far the most important one. So we still don't really know exactly what they're thinking, but the implication seems to be that as short a time as possible means whatever time the UK thinks is possible. That was 2025 in the original projections. So their case seems to be, basically, we'll tell you when we think we can achieve compliance. And then they list a lot of excuses. The failure of the Euro standards, which absolutely I agree with. There's absolutely no questioning that European regulation has failed to deliver real-world emissions from diesel vehicles. What they don't mention is that they've known about that since before 2005 and have done absolutely nothing about it. They've failed, in particular, to stop the growth in the numbers of diesel vehicles on our roads. They also refer to breaches in other member states. True, but it's not going to get them off the hook. If anything, it just shows how important this case is and how much we need a really strong judgment from the European Court. If you ask me, I think this was DEFRA's strategy all along. They wanted to delay this for as long as possible whilst trying to use the ongoing review of EU legislation to basically try and get rid of these limits. This is what they said as part of the red tape challenge exercise. Frankly, to me, the idea that air quality laws should be seen as some kind of red tape is frankly ridiculous and shows exactly the kind of attitudes we've got within some quarters of government on these issues. But this is what they said. They were going to use the review of air quality legislation to try and reduce the infraction risk faced by member states in relation to nitrogen dioxide. Basically, what they'd look to do is try and get more time extensions or try and degrade the nitrogen dioxide limit from a binding limit into some kind of weaker, non-binding target, which would be absolutely useless to someone like me. But thankfully, they failed for the reasons that Jack mentioned earlier. The Commission just thought it was too much of a risk, decided to leave the Ambient Air Quality Directive where it was, focus on enforcing that, and then we'll come back to that in 5 years' time. So if I gaze into my crystal ball and try and work out what's going to happen next, which is always a pretty dangerous exercise in litigation, particularly given the problems we've had, I think we're going to get judgment hopefully before Christmas from the European Court. I think that's going to come down on our side. I think it's going to set some very clear guidance on what as short as possible means in this context. We'll then come back to the Supreme Court, hopefully in the first quarter of next year. And we want a mandatory order, an order which forces the government to come up with a new set of plans to tackle nitrogen dioxide. That's going to need a comprehensive range of measures, particularly focusing on driving down diesel emissions. When that will be able to deliver compliance, I don't know. It certainly won't be 2015, that's for sure. But it will be a lot shorter than the current time frame that we're looking at. What does this mean for Sheffield? I mentioned that Sheffield wasn't originally part of our case. It wasn't one of the 16 zones and agglomerations. But these are the 12 zones that apply for a time extension. Sorry, there were 24 that applied for a time extension. 12 of those time extensions were rejected by the European Commission. So for these zones, they don't have a time extension. So the original deadline was 2010, and they're still in breach. So that puts them kind of in the same place as the other 16. So whilst not officially part of our case, it has some pretty clear implications for all these zones. What's more, the night before the European Court hearing, DEFRA, in their wisdom, decided to publish new projections on when they would achieve NO2 compliance based on their current plans. And they showed that for some cities in the UK, London, Leeds, Birmingham, they won't achieve compliance until after 2030. So that's 20 years after the original deadline. The majority of other cities were sometime around 2025, including Sheffield, I think. So basically, our case now encompasses pretty much the whole of the UK, apart from, I think, the Outer Hebrides, the Highlands of Scotland, and places like this. And what we're starting to see now, certainly in the last year, has been political movement. Boris has come forward with his ideas for an ultra-low emission zone in London. This brilliant cartoon from Clean Air in London shows why some of us are a bit sceptical about his idea. It really only includes that very tiny part of central London covered by the congestion charging zone. There's all kinds of other problems with it I won't go into. But it shows that he's trying to put some clear distance between himself and the national government on this issue. If it comes to the worst, he wants to make damn sure that London isn't left holding the baby. We're also seeing the Labour Party coming forward with some ideas on this, all pretty vague at the moment. They've said they want a national framework of low emission zones. They've not said what that's going to look like. They seem to have forgotten that the current government also promised us that and failed to deliver it. So I'm still a bit sceptical about Labour, but at least they are starting to make a bit of noise on the issue. The Liberal Democrats, similarly, have made a commitment to, it's a bit of a strange one, something about bringing in targets for air quality. I'm a bit confused because we already have them. We just aren't complying with them. But we'll see what they mean by that. I think if I was advising a local authority, or for that matter, a local campaigning group, I'd be saying now is the time. Now is the opportunity to really be making a big noise about what you want. Because I think there is an understanding now that this problem has been dumped down at the local authority level without giving local authorities any of the policy levers or the funds or the resources they actually need to solve it. So now I think people should be doing what Boris has done. He's quite shrewdly come forward and said, look, this is what I can do, and this is what I need national government and the EU to do. And I think that's quite a good strategy for local authorities as well. They can say, look, we've done all these great things in Sheffield or Bristol or wherever, but that's only going to get us this far. We need national measures and EU measures to fix the problem longer term. And I think the perfect example of that would be this national network of low emission zones. I mean, where is it? Why haven't they produced it? There are many cities we speak to who are interested in setting up a low emission zone. They can't do it. They don't have the tools. You need a national system which certifies that the retrofit equipment, the stuff that goes on the back of the exhaust pipe and cleans up the NOx and the PM, we need to know it actually works. We need to know it actually works when you drive it on the roads rather than just in the lab. And we need to know it works in a city like Sheffield where you've got hills everywhere, as well in cities where you're just driving around on the flat. So then we need a national system which sets a standard for low emission zones, but we know that the Euro standards aren't working, so we need something else. We need a safety net. We need something that guarantees that vehicles driving on the roads are actually performing in real life. And that's just one measure. I mean, what we need here is a really comprehensive strategy to clean up nitrogen dioxide pollution, but at the same time, optimizing the benefits for other pollutants, black carbon, particulate matter. So we're taking a much more holistic approach beyond EU limit values towards the much stricter WHO guidelines. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
IKEA could have done something, I mean, good traffic planners and planners put these things in city centres so that you can try and help the city centre as well as the IKEA. Southampton did that. They put it right in the city centre. You can park in IKEA and walk to the city centre. It's possible. Here in Sheffield, they put it in the most polluting area. You can argue about whether they should have had an IKEA or not, but given that we've got an IKEA, more could have been done. And the air quality assessment suggested it shouldn't be there. So, given the assessment said that it shouldn't be there and the sort of minimal level of mitigation that seems to have come across, could somebody perhaps in the audience challenge that, and on what grounds, and could that precedent of a bad development in the wrong, or could be a good development, but a development in the wrong place in other cities around the UK, could they be challenged? How can we use the law to deal with that sort of thing?
I really wish that one of the questions that we'd referred to the European Court was on this issue. Unfortunately, it never really arose in our case. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I wish that was one of the questions we'd refer to the European Court, but unfortunately it didn't really come up in our case, so we couldn't. But it seems to me that this issue about air quality within planning decisions is one that's ripe for a European judgment. Because it seems to me that the way that it's typically approached by courts in Britain is very much at odds with the way a European court would look at it. And unfortunately, you see some cases in the UK going the right way. You see developments, you see planning approval being overturned because it would make air quality worse. But you see a hell of a lot just waved through, even where, like IKEA, you're seeing clear negative impacts on air quality. So I think you could construct a good case on the grounds that development shouldn't go ahead because it would delay the time in which we would comply with nitrogen dioxide limits. I think there is a good case to be made there, particularly if you start using the EU law arguments rather than just framing it in terms of domestic law. But I think what we really need is some very clear guidance. I mean, it was mentioned before. Local authorities need a really clear steer on how they should be managing air quality within planning decisions, because at the moment I think they're completely confused. And so even where you have a good air quality officer or planning officer at the local authority level, they don't have the tools, they don't have the guidance that they can use to go to others within the local authority and say, look, we can't let this go through, or we can only let this go through if we impose some pretty strict requirements on mitigation.
short, specific questions for Alan before we broaden it out and have the guys at the front asking all the questions. Over here, then over here.
How are you funded? I mean, you said it's an expensive operation, you know, so where does Client Earth get the funding to pursue this?
Big grant-giving foundations. So you'll have probably heard of like the Gates Foundation. Bill Gates has got one. The Clintons have got one as well. Unfortunately, we don't get any money from them. But these kinds of big philanthropic organisations, they have these big grants. You have to apply for them, and we've had mixed success at getting that kind of funding. I mean, yeah, it's a constant battle.
That shortest possible time. Is there an argument, a legal argument, about the impact on children's health, and that we've got a whole generation that we know about that has grown up whilst emissions are being breached, limits are being breached? And it's a legal question in that is the case law about impact on that section of the population, and
I think
being culpable around that.
The way the EU directive works is it kind of takes the health impact as a given. You don't actually have to prove that this has a health impact. The limits assume that there is a health impact from air pollution and set the level. So if there's a breach of that limit, you assume the health impact.
But in that short time, I see the argument I was trying to make.
I do. I think it would be helpful.
The level of impact is greatest on the very young.
Yeah.
So aren't we? Is there some test of reasonableness about we should be addressing that because of who it's impacting on?
I think it's an interesting argument, and I think it definitely helps when sort of making these points. You know, judges are human beings.
Yeah.
You know, I think we made a very good case in the court of actually making this real. It's not just a case of meeting a number, a limit. It was about impact on human health and children's health in particular. So yeah, I think it's definitely relevant context.
The current debate which is taking place now on a referendum over Europe, is that, in your view, being stimulated by both the business interests and the ideological interests to escape the regulations?
I don't know, because I think most sane business people you speak to are quite pro-Europe. Because I mean, they see. Yeah, I mean, everyone's got problems with Europe. I mean, everyone has something about it they dislike. But I mean, in terms of if you're a businessman, you see the markets that it gives you access to. No, I don't see that. What I do see is that something like air quality and other environmental issues, to me, are what we should be explaining to people and what politicians should be using as one of the reasons we need to be in Europe. I mean, these sort of basic protections on human health we wouldn't have if it wasn't for Europe. And so I think that's something we sort of forget.